Now let's take a look at history and find out. The problem is that it's very hard to connect the dots to really realize what's really going on. And that's what we're going to try to do here. And of course, stepping back enables us to try and connect the dots because the media and the educational system will not do it for us. So I encourage everyone to do their own research and exchange their results in the comments of this video. The public banking system has been starting wars for centuries to force their banking system on various countries. The American Revolution was primarily inspired by King George III's Currency Act, which forced colonists to use only printed banknotes borrowed from the Bank of England at a costly interest rate. But what most people don't know is that the colonists had created their own money, their own interest-free money called the colonial script. Here's a quote from Benjamin Franklin that explains how it works. Quote, "That is simple. In the colonies, we issue our own money. It's called colonial script. We issue it in proper proportion to the demands of trade and industry to make the products pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating for ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay." End of quote. And guess what? The people prospered until the Bank of England and their paid-for king made it illegal. Thomas Jefferson knew what would happen, and he describes the mess that we're into today. Quote, "If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless and the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs." End of quote. What Jefferson is really saying in here is that basic mathematics, whoever issues and controls currency at interest will eventually own everything. John Adams answered this quote from Thomas Jefferson by saying, "All the perplexities, confusion, and distresses in America arise not from defects in the Constitution or Confederation, nor from want of honor or virtue, as much from downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation." End of quote. Now, if you doubt that, here's a quote from Mayor Amschel Rothschild. Quote, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws." And of course, he was successful in creating the first bank of the United States in 1791. And by the end of its charter, the U.S. economy was in ruins, except, of course, for the banker. Now, when Congress refused to renew this charter and wanted to go back to interest-free state-issued money, Rothschild threatened the U.S. with war. He tried to convince Mr. Percival, which was the British PM, to start a war to take the colonies back, and he was assassinated when he refused. His replacement supported the war. It was the War of 1812. Now, even if the United States won the war, they were so much in debt that they had to give a new charter to a private central bank that issued currency and loans with interest. The second bank of the USA was created, and guess what? It brought the US back into ruins. Debt, unemployment, poverty, until Andrew Jackson came along and had a campaign slogan of "Jackson and no banks." He became president and blocked the renewal of the charter for the second USA Bank. The result was that he became the only president of the United States to pay off a national debt. And guess what? An assassination attempt was made on him but failed. The second USA bank failed after 5 years. The next president, Zachary Taylor, also opposed the National Bank, and guess what? He was poisoned with arsenic and died.
Well, James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States,
Who also opposed a central bank.
he's hosted a dinner at the National Hotel in Washington, D.C., where several guests fell ill and some died. Actually, 36 hotel guests died. Now, of course, the media tells us that the event was known as the National Hotel Disease and was basically due to hygienic conditions. But as all of this happened very shortly after his inauguration, I'll leave it up to your judgment to figure out if this was an assassination attempt or not.
It doesn't take a PhD to figure out that we have a pattern here. Then came the Civil War. The private central bank offered to fund Lincoln at 30% interest. Talk about a mafia-inspired loan. He answered he would not free slaves to enslave everybody else to the bankers, and he issued a new government interest-free currency that was called the greenback. So the bankers tried to influence the media to have people reject Lincoln's greenback. Here's a quote from Abraham Lincoln. "I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the bankers in the rear. Of the two, the one at my rear is my greatest foe." End quote. Bankers urged Europe to support the Confederacy to defeat Abraham Lincoln's Union. So France and Britain were considering attacking the United States. But Russia prevented them. Alexander II had just ended serfdom and started a state bank, and he authorized aid to Abraham Lincoln. And guess what? Multiple assassination attempts were made on his life. Now, after the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln said he was continuing greenbacks, and well, you guessed it, he was assassinated, and after his death, the greenbacks were pulled from circulation, and the U.S. was forced to go back to a public bank issuing interest. Then came along James Garfield in 1880, who was also in support of government money, and guess what? He was shot in 1881. President McKinley followed in 1886, favored gold-backed currencies, and well, you guessed it, he was shot in 1901. And then came the famous meeting on Jekyll Island in 1910, where 6 of the greatest bankers, organized by J.P. Morgan, got together, and that's when the third U.S. bank currency was born. Here's an interesting coincidence. Did you know that J.P. Morgan owned the Titanic? And wouldn't you know that the 3 men that opposed J.P. Morgan's bank plan were on the Titanic when it sank? Let's just put this one in the realm of really strange coincidences. The third U.S. bank was approved in 1913 when most congressmen were on Christmas holidays, and it became today's Federal Reserve, which answers to no one, not even Congress, and it is exempt from all taxation. Here's a quote from President Woodrow Wilson. "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." End quote. Now, consider one fact, that before the Federal Reserve was invented, there had never been such a thing as a world war. At the onset of World War I, Germany was forced to pay for the war at interest. When Adolf Hitler came into power, he issued government-based currency. The German economy flourished, so Germany became a threat to the private banking system. So they looked for an excuse to go to war, and Hitler gave it to them. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Accord named the US dollar as reserve currency, replacing the British pound, under two conditions. First, to not overprint money, and to keep it tied to a gold reserve. None of these are honored today. Enter John F. Kennedy, who issued a new government currency called the US note, backed by silver. $4.5 billion worth went into circulation, and the pattern repeats itself. You guessed it. John F. Kennedy was assassinated 5 months later. And the first thing Lyndon Baines Johnson, his vice president and successor, did was to pull the notes from circulation and destroy them. Oswald was supposedly linked to the Communist Party and blah blah blah. He was conveniently assassinated by Ruby and never appeared in court. Of course, history tells us that all of these assassination attempts are not related to the fact that these presidents opposed a national interest-bearing bank. But the coincidence is just too crazy for us to ignore. As I said before, what we're doing here is connecting the dots. The United States printed so much money that they could not pay the countries who wanted to cash in on the gold. So Nixon destroyed the connection between US currency and gold. As the faith of the US dollar started to dwindle, the petrodollar was created with an agreement that the countries that bought gas would only transact in US dollars in exchange for military protection. No wonder the US spends around 50% of their annual budget on military. They're not just protecting themselves, they're protecting the whole of NATO. Now, when Iraq wanted to sell their oil for euros, they were invaded under the fake threat of weapons of mass destruction, which is now part of history. That we know there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. When Libya announced that they were going to sell their oil in their own state-owned value-based currency, US invaded Libya and killed their leader and imposed a central private banking system. So here's the cycle of corruption of our central bank money system. 1. Banks issue currency with interest. 2. Forces countries and people into growing debt. 3. When the people stop borrowing, wars are waged to force everyone into more debt. Have you ever heard of a nation that did not go to war because they couldn't afford it? There's always enough money for war, but never enough money for education, healthcare, feeding people. 4. You borrow even more to rebuild. 5. In the end, there are millions of dead people, and the only ones that profited are the bankers. And of course, the cycle goes on, rinse and repeat. World War III will most likely be created to force the world into CBDC, which means a central bank digital currency, to exercise even more control over us. So spread awareness and use the internet to your advantage. In conclusion, I think these 3 videos reflecting on creativity and money are important to open our minds and free us from this endless interest-bearing matrix But the next video will show us the spiritual value of creativity and how useless and insignificant our perception of money is on a universal scale. It's going to be a really big exercise in stepping back. Like and subscribe if you enjoy these videos on creativity, and look for the next videos on creativity and money.